This is LSAT Prep Test 132, Section 1, Passage 3. This is a dual or comparative passage set. The topic is dental caries and ancient diets. It's a medium difficulty passage set. The science is pretty straightforward. What makes this tricky is that the two passages look like they disagree, but that actually don't. Now, both of them start from the same premise, that carbohydrate-heavy diets cause more cavities. Passage A establishes that rule, then Passage B applies it to a real archaeological site. And when the data doesn't match the simple version of that principle, students will panic and think Passage B is attacking Passage A, but it's not. So you want to pay attention to that. Now, Passage A, paragraph 1 is pure setup. Dental caries link to sticky, carbohydrate-rich foods. And prehistoric teeth can show us when a population shifted to farming. You want to move through this pretty quickly. It's giving you the premise, not the core argument. Then paragraph 2 of Passage A slows down on the mechanism. Caries depend on tooth structure, bacteria, and diet. But the one the passage really cares about is diet. The word composition is doing real work here around carbohydrate texture. It means that not all carbs are equal. Some stick to teeth more than others. And that idea comes back in Passage B, so you want to flag it mentally. Then paragraph 3 is your evidence. Lay's North America study, meat-eating populations had almost no caries. Maize-eating populations hit 75%, and other researchers confirmed it. So if they have more dependence on agriculture, they have more caries. Looks like it's a pretty rock-solid pattern. Now, here is the paragraph that matters most in Passage A. It's the last one. It opens with, under some circumstances, however. And that's a signal, it's a change in direction. It's telling you that the clean rule you just learned actually has some holes or gaps in it. There are some non-agricultural populations that still got high caries rates. Groups in Western North America ate stone ground acorn flour. The Hopi gathered wild plants that were highly cariogenic. And so the real driver isn't farming, it's the specific food they're eating. You can get caries without agriculture if you're eating the wrong stuff. And if you miss that paragraph, you're going to misread the entire relationship between the two passages. Now, Passage B. The archaeologists recovered skeletal remains from Ban Chang, Thailand, with 2,000 years of data. The population shifted from hunter-gatherer-cultivator to agricultural. And so based on everything Passage A just told you, you would think caries would spike. That's the expectation they want you to have going in, but they actually don't spike. Caries frequency is only slightly higher in the early group, not the late group, the early group. It's counterintuitive, right? So you're going to want to read that sentence carefully because it's easy to flip it around and get confused when you're in the middle of the passage. And then Passage B explains why. The diet in the late period stayed varied and no single food took over. And there may have been a shift from yams toward rice, and rice is a less cariogenic carbohydrate, and so that is your connection. Passage A told you composition matters. Passage B shows a case where a shift in composition kept caries stable even as agriculture grew. Now, the key thing you want to keep in mind across both passages is that Passage B doesn't break Passage A's rule, it confirms the deeper version of it. The simple rule is more agriculture equals more caries. But the real rule, which you see at the end of Passage A, is that the type of carbohydrate matters more than whether you're farming or not. Ban Chang is a case study that proves the refined version of the rule. And so the main trap is reading these as opposing passages. Students will see unexpected results in Passage B and assume it's contradicting Passage A. But Passage A has already built in the exception. The last paragraph of Passage A is the bridge between them. And if you miss that paragraph's function, you're going to get the relationship questions wrong. Now, one more thing you want to note here, you want to watch the difference between what Passage A says about non-agricultural populations and what Passage B says about Ban Chang. Passage A's exceptions are groups that didn't farm but still ate cariogenic foods. Ban Chang is a group that did farm but shifted to less cariogenic foods. Same principle, opposite direction, and the LSAT loves that kind of mirror. Now, before you hit the questions, you want to lock down on three things. First, why does the last paragraph of Passage A change the simple rule from the rest of the passage? Second, what specific dietary shift at Ban Chang explains the unexpected caries data? And third, can you state in one sentence how the two passages relate without calling it a contradiction. So that was passage 3. We're going to go on now to passage 4. I'm just going to get set up here. And by the way, folks, if you're looking for help, I'm offering a free LSAT tutoring lesson for anybody watching this now or later. The link to book that free tutoring with me is unpluggedprep.com/start. The link is below the video on YouTube, pinned in the chat on YouTube, in my bio on TikTok and IG as well. Now, this is LSAT Prep Test 132, Section 1, Passage 4. This is about Sarah Orne Jewett and whether she belongs in the same category as the domestic novelists who came before her. It's a medium difficulty passage. The trap here is that the passage opens by describing a connection that it spends the rest of its time tearing apart. And if you don't catch that turn, you're going to think the passage supports the link. Now, this is a humanities passage and it's making an argument. Recent critics have tried to group Jewett with domestic novelists. The passage says that's a bad comparison based on surface level similarities. Now, the most important paragraph here is paragraph 2. That's where the passage shifts from describing differences to explaining why those differences exist. And the answer it lands on changes everything about how you understand Jewett's work, and I'm going to come back to that. Now, paragraph 1 is doing two things at once. It opens with the critic's claim that Jewett and the domestic novelists both wrote about women, home life, and social interactions, with men pushed to the side. Sounds like a match. But then the passage flips immediately. It says the work differs markedly. And it gives you two big differences. First, domestic novels are built around children and child rearing. That is their main source of drama. And for Jewett, though, children are almost entirely absent. Second, and the passage flags this as being even more important with the phrase even more strikingly, the domestic novelists are deeply religious, and Protestant structures run through their work. Jewett's world is secular. And so paragraph 1 hands you the critic's argument and then starts dismantling it before it even finishes. Now, you've got to read this paragraph knowing that the similarities are just the setup and the differences are actually the point. Now, paragraph 2 is where most students get lost. It opens with what looks like a reasonable explanation. Maybe the differences are just historical. People moved to cities, society got more secular, and that would explain why Jewett writes differently. And the passage doesn't reject that. It says those factors may help to explain the differences. But then comes the pivot. You want to watch out for the word but. The passage says those historical explanations are not enough. The real issue is that these writers had completely different ideas about what fiction is for. So they go from saying, maybe it's just historical context, to it is actually a fundamental disagreement about the purpose of writing. And then paragraph 2 shows you what that disagreement looks like. Domestic fiction was part of a continuum. And that word matters because they're going to ask about it. The passage means that novels, child rearing manuals, and religious tracts were all blurred together. A single book could be all three at once. The goal was promoting morality and religious belief. Fiction was just a delivery system. Then, right at the end of paragraph 2, the passage introduces Jewett's side. Her writing fits the high cultural conception of fiction, meaning fiction as its own thing, with value in itself, not a tool for teaching lessons. And that contrast is the core of the entire passage. Domestic novelists used fiction to accomplish something outside of fiction. Jewett treated fiction as the destination, not the vehicle. Then paragraph 3 fills in the history of that high cultural view. It existed as early as the 1850s, but became dominant later in the century. With this view, fiction is pure art. You judge it by how it's put together, not by what social good it promotes. And then the passage delivers its conclusion. Jewett's works were ends in themselves. The domestic novelist's work was a means to an end. And that final sentence really lands the punch here. This fundamental difference should carry more weight than any similarity in subject matter. So that is the passage looking straight at those recent critics from paragraph 1 and saying they got it wrong. Now, the key move here is the distinction between fiction as a tool and fiction as an end. And every hard question in this passage is going to circle back to that. The LSAT writers want to know if you understand the passage isn't comparing what these writers wrote about, it's comparing why they wrote at all. Now, here is where students go wrong. They remember the opening, that Jewett and domestic novelists share some surface features, and they let that stick. Then, when a question asks about the author's view, they pick an answer that treats the connection as legitimate when it's not. The author thinks the connection is shallow. So any answer that treats the similarities as meaningful or treats the comparison as valid is going to be a trap. You also want to watch out for the historical explanation in paragraph 2. The passage doesn't say that migration and secularization are wrong, it says they're not enough. So if you see a choice that says the differences are fully explained by historical change, that's wrong. The passage is careful to say those factors only help. And one more thing, by the way. The word continuum shows up, and they're going to ask what it means. Don't overthink it. The passage is saying domestic fiction wasn't treated as a separate category. It sat on a spectrum with instruction manuals and religious writing. They were all part of the same project. That's all continuum means here. Now, before you hit the questions, you want to make sure you're clear on these 3 things. First, can you explain the difference between what the recent critics believe and what the passage argues? Second, do you know why the passage brings up historical factors and then sets them aside? And third, can you state in one sentence what the author thinks the real difference between Jewett and the domestic novelists is? So that was passage 4. We're going to go on now to test 131. Just pulling it up here, folks. You can find these inside your LSAT Law Hub account. This is LSAT PrepTest 131, Section 4, Passage 1. It's a comparative or dual passage set about parallel computing. It's a pretty low difficulty set. The ideas are pretty accessible, and neither author is really hiding the ball here, but they're going to punish you if you treat the 2 passages as being interchangeable. Now, both passages are about splitting big computational problems across many processors working at the same time. That's the common ground, but they come at it from totally different places. And if you flatten that difference, you're going to get the relationship questions wrong. Now, the most important paragraph in the whole set is paragraph 3 of passage B. That's where you find out what passage B actually cares about. Everything before that is just set up, and I'm going to come back to that. Now, passage A is solving a specific problem. Paragraph 1 gives you the setup. Climate models work, but they use a ton of variables. Small shifts in these variables change the output, so you've got to test every combination. You don't want to slow down here. Your only job here is to register the scale of the problem. That's all this paragraph does. Then paragraph 2 doubles down on scale. The brute force method means millions of simulation runs, and one computer can't handle all that. That math example with 2 million runs is not something you've got to memorize. It exists just to make you feel the impossibility. So read it, get the point, and then keep moving. Paragraph 3 is where passage A lands. Desktop computers linked through the internet can share the work, problem solved. Except not quite, because look at the very last part of the paragraph. The author adds a catch. These projects only succeed when they grab enough public interest to get people to participate, and that is a real condition. It means the author is not saying this is a guaranteed fix. The author is saying this can work if. So that if is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. If you miss it, you're going to overstate how confident the author is. Then on to passage B. Paragraph 1, they zoom way out. It's not about climate models or about any one problem. The author is saying that tons of problems across nature, society, and science share a structure. Lots of simple parts acting on basic rules that together create complex behavior. The author calls these parallel problems. That just means the parts can all operate at the same time. You want to move through the paragraph here at a pretty steady pace. They're just defining a category. Paragraph 2 is about the ant colony. A single ant is almost nothing. Just a few neurons following basic rules. But thousands of ants together look like they're thinking. So this paragraph is an illustration. It makes the abstract idea from paragraph 1 feel concrete. But this is just doing one job here. It's showing you what a naturally parallel system looks like. Get through it pretty fast. Then paragraph 3 of passage B is the whole game. The author says computing is shifting from sequential to parallel. And here is the actual argument. If the problem itself is parallel, then the tool you use to solve it should be parallel also. So you want to match the shape of the solution to the shape of the problem. The old sequential model hits a speed wall, the parallel model doesn't. The author is saying here this is the obviously correct approach. So here is the relationship. Passage A gives you a case study. One problem, one solution, one practical limitation. Passage B gives you a theory, a whole framework for understanding why parallel computing is the right direction. If the author of passage B would read passage A, they would point at the climate modeling project and say, That is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. But the author of passage A never makes that bigger claim. They stay narrow on purpose. So the author of passage B is actually cautiously practical. It can work, but depends on public buy-in. The author of passage B is making a stronger case. Parallel computing is the model that fits how these problems are built. The trap here is reading both authors like they're saying the same thing, but they're not. One is reporting on a project, the other is arguing for a principle. Students who miss that are going to pick wrong answers on any question about how these passages relate to each other. They'll choose options that make both authors sound equally ambitious, but passage A is practical. Now, the key move across this pair is the scope difference. Passage A is focused on one problem, one solution with one caveat. Passage B is a claim about how all problems like this should be solved. And the hardest questions are going to test whether you can keep that definition separate. Now, before you get to the questions, you want to check yourself on these three things. First, why does passage A bother with that 2 million runs example? Second, what is the ant colony actually doing in passage B's argument? And third, what would the author of passage B think about the public participation requirement at the end of passage A? So that was passage 1. We're going to cover passage 2 now. This is LSAT PrepTest 131, Section 4, Passage 2. It's about why law schools should teach more statutory law. It's a pretty low difficulty passage, but even low difficulty passages can have their own traps because students overthink them when they expect a twist that never comes. Now, this is a straightforward opinion passage. The author thinks law schools focus too much on case analysis and not enough on statutes. That's it. There are no competing views, no mystery or dilemma about where the author stands. You're going to know their position by the end of the first sentence. Now, the most important paragraph here is paragraph 4. Everything before it moves in one direction. Paragraph 4 is the only place where the author even acknowledges another side. And what they do with that objection, is the thing the test will come after the hardest. Now, paragraph 1 is the setup. Law schools teach students to dig through old court decisions and match them to new situations. The author says that gives students a distorted picture of what actual legal practice looks like. Now, you don't have to slow down here at all. The opinion is wide open from the jump. Just law schools are doing this wrong. Grab the complaint and keep moving. Paragraph 2 gives you the first reason statutes matter, and it starts off with a simple example. A lawyer with a tax question can sometimes just read the statute and get a direct answer. But that example is bait. The real point comes at the end of the paragraph. The author says statutes aren't always that clear. Sometimes they are genuinely hard to interpret. And that's why students need to learn how to work through them. So the paragraph actually flips things around. It starts off by making statutes sound easy, then it pulls out the rug and says, no, they're hard, and that's why you need training. If you only remember the tax example, you've grabbed the wrong piece here. Now, paragraph 3 is the second reason with a different skill this time. Paragraph 2 was about interpretation. Paragraph 3 is about synthesis. The author says case-based teaching trains you to zoom in. You get really good at pulling apart one case, but you never learn how to zoom out and see how a bunch of laws in the same area connect to each other. Studying statutes would build that skill. And then right at the end, the author ties it to specialization. And that last sentence there is doing real work. It's saying this is not some abstract nice to have. Students are going to specialize. They've got to see how laws in their area fit together. So you don't want to skip past that connection. Now, paragraph 4, you want to slow down here. That's where the passage gets into the meat of the questions. The author raises an objection against their own argument. Statutes differ from region to region. So if you learn one region's statutes, that knowledge doesn't travel with you. And here's the part that trips people up. The author agrees. They say there is some truth to that. And so if you're reading fast, it feels like the author is backing down, but they're not. The author splits the objection in two. They say, yes, the specific knowledge won't transfer, but the skills you build while learning those statutes absolutely will. So knowledge versus skills. The objection only works if you think learning statutes is about memorizing rules. The author says, no, it's about building a transferable ability. And once you see that split, the objection falls apart. and the author's position is exactly as strong at the end as it was at the beginning. Now, the key move here is that concession, then rejection in paragraph 4. The author lets the objection in the front door and then shows it out the back. The hardest questions in this passage are going to test whether you understood that the concession doesn't actually cost the author anything. Now, the author's stance here is fully one-sided. They want more statutory law in law schools, period. The main trap here is reading that moment in paragraph 4 as genuine uncertainty. Students who see the phrase "there is some truth" and think the author is hedging are going to pick answers that describe the author as being tentative or partially convinced by the counterargument, and that is wrong. The author here is confident from start to finish. The concession is just a rhetorical move. Now, before you go on to the questions, you want to check yourself on these 3 things. First, can you name 2 separate reasons the author gives for teaching statutory law? Hint, they're in paragraphs 2 and 3, and they target different skills. Second, do you understand why paragraph 4 exists if the author is just going to reject the objection? You want to know what that paragraph is doing for the argument. And third, can you explain the knowledge versus skills distinction the author draws at the very end? That's where the toughest questions are going to draw from. So that was passage 2, folks. On to passage 3. And by the way, for those with questions, I'm going to get into questions in my daily live Q&A in about an hour and a half at 2 p.m. Eastern on YouTube, TikTok, IG, wherever you're watching this. For this live, we're just going through reading comp. This is LSAT Prep Test 131, Section 4, Passage 3. This is a humanities passage about the sculptor Isamu Noguchi. I'll start over. This is LSAT Prep Test 131, Section 4, Passage 3. Humanities passage about Noguchi. The topic is one specific creative breakthrough and the idea behind it. It's a medium difficulty passage. It reads like a story, which makes it seem pretty easy, but there's a concept buried in the middle that's doing all the heavy lifting, and most students glide right past it. Now, this passage is a chronological narrative with an argument hiding inside it. Noguchi goes from being a talented young sculptor to a radical innovator. But the main point is not that he was talented or creative, it's that he figured out a way to make sculpture work through reflection instead of shadow. And that idea changed what a sculpture even is. Now, the most important paragraph here is paragraph 4. That's where the passage transitions from being a biography to being about an idea. Everything before it is just set up. Now, paragraph 1 introduces Noguchi and makes one claim, that he thought differently from other artists. He had a scientist's brain in an artist's career. So the author here is setting up a frame for the entire passage. Every paragraph after this is evidence for that opening claim. But the paragraph itself is just the opening. You want to grab the idea of the scientist's mind and then keep moving. Now, paragraph 2 is longer, and there's a lot of biographical detail here. It's meant to trip you up. They're talking about the Guggenheim Fellowship going to Paris, talking his way into Brancusi's studio as a stonecutter. And students love this stuff because it's concrete and easy to follow, but none of it matters for the questions. The only thing this paragraph does structurally is set up one idea at the end. Noguchi notices that every sculptor in history has used shadows to show form, and the passage calls this negative light. And the reason is practical. No affordable metal could stay reflective, only gold could, but it cost too much. So the shadow was the only option anybody ever had, and that is the problem Noguchi wants to solve. Everything else in this paragraph is just backstory. Then paragraph 3 solves the problem of materials. Noguchi meets Buckminster Fuller. Fuller tells them about chrome nickel steel, which Ford has just made commercially available. So now there is an affordable metal that stays reflective. That is the entire paragraph. That is one practical development that makes the next idea possible. You don't want to slow down here because they're getting to the main point. They're building up to it. Paragraph 4 is where you want to slow way down. Read every sentence carefully. Noguchi realizes that a fully reflective surface doesn't just look different from a traditional sculpture, it behaves differently. A reflective surface becomes invisible, and the passage compares it to perfectly calm water. You can't see the water itself, you only know it's there because the sky and the trees show up in it. Then it gives you the seaplane pilot detail. A pilot landing on dead calm water literally cannot tell where the surface is. And this analogy is meant to explain how sculpture works. You don't look at Noguchi's sculpture, You look at the distorted reflections of everything around it. And then from those distortions, you figure out the sculpture's shape. Now, there's this word secondarily that pops up near the end, and it tells you that the viewer never directly perceives the sculpture. The sculpture reveals itself through what it does to its surroundings, and that is a complete inversion of how sculpture had always worked. Shadow sculpture says, look at me. Noguchi sculpture says, look at what I'm doing to everything else. And that distinction is what the hardest questions are going to test. If you walk away from this passage thinking Noguchi just found a shinier metal, you're going to pick wrong answers that sound right. Now, paragraph 5 is 2 sentences. Noguchi kept pushing forward even after this breakthrough got recognized. So it circles back to that idea from the opening about his restless scientific mindset. There's nothing new here. They're just circling back to the beginning. Now, the key move here is the leap from paragraph 3 to paragraph 4. Paragraph 3 gives Noguchi new material. Paragraph 4 shows that the material wasn't the point. The material made a new concept possible, and that concept is what changed everything. And you could bet they're going to build questions around whether you understand that difference. Now, in terms of tone, the author's stance here is admiration, but it's specific. The author thinks Noguchi's gift was asking questions nobody else thought to ask. That word inquisitive in the last paragraph is important. You got to realize the whole passage is one example of exactly that quality that Noguchi has. The main trap in this passage is reading it as being a biography. The story is engaging, of course. You've got Brancusi's studio, Buckminster Fuller, chrome nickel steel. It's fun to read maybe, but the story is not the point here. The concept is the point. The right answers here are about Noguchi's conceptual breakthrough with regard to reflective sculpture. Now, before you get to the questions, you want to check yourself on these 3 things. First, can you explain why shadows were the default for all of sculpture history? Second, can you say in your own words what makes a reflective sculpture fundamentally different, not just visually different? And third, do you know why the author opens and closes the passage with Noguchi's scientific mindset? So that was passage 3. We're going to cover passage 4 now. And by the way, folks, if you're looking for support, I'm offering free LSAT tutoring for everybody watching this now or later. The link to book that free tutoring lesson with me is unpluggedprep.com/start. Link is below the video on YouTube, pinned in the chat on YouTube, in my bio on TikTok and IG as well. This is LSAT Prep Test 131, Section 4, Passage 4, about the ultimatum game. It's a social science passage, fairly low difficulty passage. Content's pretty easy. The trap is that it feels so straightforward that you might stop paying attention when you get to the real argument that's being presented here. Now, this is a puzzle and explanation passage. Something weird happens. There are 2 theories advanced to try to explain it, and the author picks one of those. The main point is that evolution shaped our emotions for small group life where everybody watched each other, and those emotions don't shut off just because we're in some anonymous lab experiment. Now, the most important paragraph here is paragraph 4. That is the author's entire argument. Everything else is just set up, starting off with paragraph 1, where you're learning the rules. One person proposes a split of $100. The other person takes it or leaves it. If they leave it, nobody gets paid. You move through this part pretty quickly, nothing controversial here. Just understand the game. Then paragraph 2 gives you the results, and that's where the passage gets a lot more interesting. Most proposers offer close to half, and almost nobody lowballs. And when somebody does offer less than 20%, the responder usually rejects it. Now, you got to stop and think about that for a minute, right? Because it's kind of funny. The responder is walking away with nothing on purpose. That is the puzzle here. Traditional economics would say that people behave out of self-interest. Any money you'd think is better than no money. So rejecting a low offer doesn't make rational sense. Don't rush here. You want to slow it down because you want to maintain the understanding here. Paragraph 3 gives you a clean, logical explanation for why. Our ancestors lived in small groups. You couldn't afford to crush the people on your own team because you needed them to fight other groups. And that might sound like it makes sense, and that's the problem. The author says this only explains why proposers offer a lot, doesn't touch the real puzzle, which is why responders would reject low offers. The author is saying this theory answers the wrong question completely. If you miss that, you're going to misunderstand the point here. You're going to misunderstand why there is a puzzle at all. And paragraph 4, the author gives you their own answer. The logic has a couple steps here you want to pay attention. First, Our emotions evolved in small groups where nothing was private. Everybody knew your business. And if people knew that you would take a lousy deal, they would keep offering you lousy deals. But if they know that you're going to get angry and reject the offer, they're going to offer you more next time. And so evolution rewarded the angry responders. They got better offers, they ate more, they survived. Now, here is the piece that actually answers the puzzle. Our brains never learned to tell the difference between a one-time anonymous game and real life. And so for that reason, you react to the ultimatum game the same way your ancestors reacted when somebody tried to short them on food around the campfire. Your emotions don't care that you're never going to see this person, and again, they fire anyway. And that mismatch between our ancient wiring and the modern lab experiment is the entire answer. Now, the key move here is right at the top of paragraph 4. The author writes more compelling. The author is telling you, the author is ranking these explanations, not just listing them out. Everything after that phrase, more compelling, is the author's endorsed position. If you missed that on your first read, you want to go back and reread that because it changes how you read what follows. Now, the big trap in this passage is walking into the questions thinking that both theories got a fair shake, that both were presented well. The first one got introduced and then got dismissed in the same paragraph. The second one got 3 times the space and the author's explicit endorsement. If you read too fast through paragraph 3 and you miss the dismissal, you're going to end up thinking the passage is balanced as a balanced survey of both of those ideas. That's going to cost you on main point questions, author's attitude questions, and anything asking about the relationship between the explanations. Now, paragraph 4 connects self-esteem to reputation to survival. The author here is saying that anger builds a reputation, and that reputation leads to better offers. And that means you are more likely to survive. If they ask you why self-esteem matters in this argument, the answer is about the survival advantage that comes from being known as somebody who's not going to take a bad deal. Now, before you go on to the questions, check yourself on these 3 things. First, can you explain in 1 sentence why the author rejects the first theory? Second, do you know what specific gap it fails to fill? And third, can you trace the chain in paragraph 4 from emotions to reputation to survival? So that was test 131, folks. I'll be back in about 1 hour for the daily live Q&A on anything at all, LSAT and law school admissions on YouTube, TikTok, IG, wherever you're watching this. I'll see you all then.